Thanksgiving dinner smelled like roasted turkey, sage, and the faint sweetness of cranberry glaze. Around the table, the chatter was warm, almost festive, until my daughter Marissa rose from her chair. She lifted her glass with the kind of composure that belongs in a courtroom, not at a family table. Her voice was steady, cold, as she said, "You are no longer part of this family." No hesitation, no crack in her tone. Every fork froze in mid-air. Every eye turned toward me. I did not argue. I did not demand an explanation. I reached down, slid a thick envelope across the table toward her, and let my hand rest on it for a moment before letting go. She frowned, the way you do when you think you are in control and suddenly realize the ground might be shifting. This is my story. I tell it as the person who lived it, a former military engineer who knows that you do not win by raising your voice. You win by holding your position, by waiting for the exact moment when the facts speak louder than you ever could. On that night, in the warm glow of a Thanksgiving dining room, with the scent of sage still in the air, I was not just a mother. I was the architect of what would happen next. The moment Marissa's words left her lips, the air in the room changed. It was no longer Thanksgiving dinner. It was a tribunal, and I was the accused. The table between us felt like a courtroom bench, the neatly carved turkey now a prop in some staged proceeding. My relatives sat frozen, their eyes flicking between her and me as if waiting for the defense to speak, but I gave them nothing. Silence has its own weight, and in that moment, it was heavier than any denial I could have offered. Marissa's husband, Evan, sat 2 seats down, and I saw it in his eyes, not shock, not discomfort, but a glint of shared purpose. He did not look at me directly. His gaze stayed fixed on the rim of his wineglass, but the corners of his mouth twitched in a way I recognized. It was the look of someone who already knew the script and was pleased to see it unfolding on schedule. That told me everything. This was not spontaneous outrage. This was planned. The clinking of cutlery had stopped. Even the fire in the hearth seemed quieter, as though the entire house was listening. Marissa let her words settle, scanning the faces around the table to see if anyone would rush to my defense. None did. Some shifted uncomfortably, others lowered their eyes, and a few looked at me with something that might have been pity. That, more than her sentence, told me where I stood in this room, alone. I did not rise to the bait. Years in the military had taught me that the first reaction in an ambush often determines whether you walk away standing or not at all. I measured my breathing, kept my shoulders square, and let the silence stretch until it began to work against them. Marissa's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. Evan's jaw moved, as if he was bracing for me to launch into a defense. I did not. Instead, I studied their body language. Evan leaned slightly toward Marissa, a small but telling shift, like a co-counsel ready to whisper the next move. Marissa, for all her calm delivery, was not immune to the small betrayals of tension, the slight tremor in her wrist as she set her glass down, the way her eyes flickered toward the envelope in front of her before quickly darting away. She knew it was there even before I slid it across the table. From my seat, I could see my sister at the far end of the table. She had been invited here by Marissa, not me, and now she wore an expression I could not read. Was it guilt, curiosity? Or simply the relief of not being the one in my position? The cousins, the uncles, the neighbors who had been pulled into this performance, they were the jury, though they had not asked to be. What Marissa had done, and done well, was control the setting. A holiday gathering was the perfect backdrop for her announcement. Surrounded by family, the act could be dressed as concern, even love. She would frame it as a necessary decision for my well-being. Something that could be softened by the presence of turkey, mashed potatoes, and polite laughter. Only it had not gone according to plan. My stillness disrupted the flow. My refusal to object, to plead my case, to give her the lines she expected. It left the room leaning forward, waiting for the rest of the scene, not realizing they were already in the middle of it. It was in that suspended moment that I took stock of what was truly at stake. This was not just about a seat at the table. This was about the roof over my head, the dignity I had carried through years of service and sacrifice, the independence I had fought to preserve after losing my husband. Marissa's declaration was the opening shot in a battle for those things, and she had chosen to fire it here, in front of the people most likely to side with her version of events. I could have spoken. I could have told them all that the house was mine, that my finances were intact, that I was more capable than they realized. but that would have played directly into her hands. Arguments in moments like this rarely win hearts. They only confirm the narrative that you are defensive, irrational, maybe even unstable. So I let the accusation hang there untouched, as if it did not merit a reply. What no one at that table knew, not Marissa, not Evan, not even my sister, was that I had already seen this coming. Weeks of careful observation had revealed cracks in their story, hints of plans made behind closed doors. I had kept my distance, gathered what I needed, and chosen my moment. And now, as the first move unfolded before me, I knew I was already 2 steps ahead. The envelope at my side was not a reflex or a token gesture. It was the first visible piece of a strategy I had built in silence. They thought they were casting me as the defendant in a family drama. What they did not realize was that I had already written the ending, and before the night was over, they would know it too. When I think about what happened that night, it is impossible not to measure it against the life that came before. Long before Marissa stood up at that Thanksgiving table, before the silence in the room hardened into something irreversible, there were years defined by a different kind of noise, the clang of tools against steel, the steady hum of machinery, the clipped voices of men and women in uniform calling out coordinates or safety checks. I spent over a decade in the service as a military engineer. It was not glamorous work, not the kind that gets your name in any headlines, but it was work that mattered. I built things to last, bridges in hostile terrain, shelters that could withstand storms, supply routes that kept others alive. There were nights so long that morning seemed like a rumor, days where we repaired damage under fire because the alternative was to let someone else pay the cost. Every bolt tightened. Every calculation double-checked was a kind of promise, this will hold. When I came home for good, I carried that same ethic with me. Civilian life felt slower, quieter, but it came with responsibilities I had chosen. My husband and I had bought the old house when Marissa was just a toddler. It had a sagging roof, peeling paint, and a basement that smelled like damp stone, but I saw the bones beneath it all. We poured years into that place. I patched the roof myself more than once, learned how to replace joists, even dug out the stubborn roots that threatened the foundation. My hands were never idle. After my husband passed, the weight of the house and the child we had raised there fell on me alone. There were no reinforcements coming, no one to split the bills with, no one to pick up the slack when I was exhausted. I worked extra shifts where I could find them, took consulting jobs, and lived on less so Marissa could have more braces when she needed them, the best school we could manage, and later, a chance to go to college without drowning in debt. Every decision was made with her future in mind. That house was more than lumber and nails. It was the physical record of my choices, of the years I had traded for stability. Every wall carried the echo of something, the laughter from her birthday parties, the late-night study sessions at the kitchen table. The quiet after a storm when we sat together, knowing we had made it through. I thought those memories would hold their shape, the way the steel frames I once welded could stand against time. Which is why what happened later cut deeper than any financial loss. Money, after all, is fluid. It moves, it can be replaced, it can be earned again. But a legacy, the kind you shape with your bare hands and the hours you never get back, that is different. When Marissa and Evan began to chip away at what I had built, it was not just about a property deed or a bank account. It was about rewriting the meaning of all those years, bending it into something that served them instead of honoring where it came from. I suppose some part of me believed that what I had done for her would stand like the structures I built in uniform, tested, unshakable. But family is not steel and concrete. It is more fragile, more vulnerable to corrosion from the inside, and when it begins to give way, the collapse is not always visible from the outside until it is too late. That is the part they never understood. They saw only the house, the assets, the things that could be counted. I saw the unseen weight behind them, the winters I spent up on that roof instead of hiring a crew, the nights I worked through pain because the mortgage was due, the mornings I left before sunrise so she could have choices I never did. That was the true inheritance, and in her eyes on that Thanksgiving night, I saw it being traded away for something smaller, something that could be sold off in pieces. It is not the betrayal of money that stays with you. It is the betrayal of memory, the quiet rewriting of your history while you are still alive to watch it happen. That was the real theft, and sitting there at that table, I knew it was the one thing I could not let them get away with. It did not happen all at once. There was no single moment when I could point to the exact beginning of their takeover. It came quietly, wrapped in the kind of gestures that are hard to refuse without sounding ungrateful. At first, it seemed like simple acts of kindness. Marissa offering to help with the paperwork so I would not have to spend hours going through forms and letters. Evan suggesting we combine accounts just to make paying bills easier. The way they framed it, these were signs of care, of efficiency. Of them stepping up to shoulder some of the weight I had carried alone for years. I had no reason to suspect anything in the early weeks. They smiled, they asked politely, they explained each step as if it were for my comfort. Marissa would sit at the dining room table with my mail spread out, sorting it into neat piles, assuring me she was only trying to keep me from getting overwhelmed. Evan would offer to run errands that happened to involve picking up my prescriptions, mailing my letters, handling the utility payments. Slowly, without my noticing, the rhythm of the house began to shift, not around my habits. But theirs, it was subtle, the way the control changed hands. A bill that had once been addressed to me arrived under a different name. The property tax notice came in their mailbox instead of mine. My email inbox started filling with confirmation messages for accounts I had not logged into in months. When I mentioned it, Marissa would smile and tell me she had updated the contact information just to make things more streamlined. Evan nodded along, adding that it was better for everything to be centralized. Then came the smart lock. One afternoon, Evan appeared with a box saying he had found a great deal on a security upgrade. It was a sleek black device that connected to his phone and he assured me could also be managed through mine if I wanted. I told him it was unnecessary. He brushed it off with a laugh, saying, "Better safe than sorry, right?" By the end of that evening, the old brass key I had used for decades was sitting in the junk drawer, replaced by a lock I had never asked for and did not fully understand. Over time, my access to my own home started to feel conditional. Sometimes I would come back from a walk and the door would not open on the first try, as if the lock were hesitating to recognize me. Other times I would notice lights on in rooms I had not been in, or furniture slightly moved. I told myself it was nothing. I wanted to believe it was nothing. The truth came one rainy afternoon when I came home earlier than expected. As I pulled into the driveway, a black sedan was parked out front. A woman in a tailored coat was standing at the porch holding a folder. She turned when she heard my car door close, gave me a polite nod, and walked briskly to her vehicle without saying a word. Inside the house, the air felt different. The faint scent of someone else's perfume lingered in the hallway. A stack of glossy brochures sat on the counter. They were real estate listings. Later, I checked the living room corner where I kept a small cabinet. Tucked between the books was a device I did not recognize, a small camera, its lens no bigger than a button. It faced the front hallway. I followed the wire to an outlet behind a chair. I unplugged it, but I did not say anything, not yet. That was when I understood that the help they had offered was not about making my life easier. It was about making their access easier. What they were building was not a system for my security. It was a structure where every decision, every key, every payment flowed through their hands first. I was still in the house, but I was no longer at the center of it. It was the slow erosion of ownership, the kind that does not come with a warning or a bang, just a quiet shift until you look up and realize the place you built has been redefined without your consent. That day, I stopped believing in their kindness. I started keeping my own notes, my own records. And I began to understand that the real danger was not in losing the house overnight. It was in waking up one morning to find that it was already gone, piece by piece, while I was still living in it. It was instinct, really the same instinct that had kept me alive during years of service. In the military, you learn to keep records for everything. You documented, cross-checked, and stored information because one day it might be the difference between fixing a problem in minutes or losing everything. That habit had never left me. So when the unease in my own home became too loud to ignore, I turned to the place I had always gone for clarity, the files. The old ledger books were kept in a metal cabinet in the garage behind a row of toolboxes. They smelled faintly of oil and paper that had absorbed years of weather. I pulled them out one by one. Setting them on the workbench, dust rose in thin clouds. The first folder I opened was marked property, deed, and tax. The deed was right where it should be, and as I ran my finger over the typed letters, I saw my name alone. No joint owner, no transfer. Whatever paperwork Marissa and Evan had been working on, it had not touched the original title. That was the first crack in their wall. Digging deeper, I found a binder labeled Financial Reserves. Inside was the documentation for a wartime contingency fund I had set up years ago when deployments were uncertain and emergencies could come without warning. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to cover months of expenses or fund a legal defense if necessary. I had never told anyone about it, not even my husband. The account was still active, untouched, and in my sole name. That was the second crack. Then I reached a folder marked Authorizations. Inside were copies of powers of attorney, some current, some expired. Most were in my handwriting with my signature and date, but two of them looked different. The pen stroke was off, the pressure inconsistent, the angle wrong. My name was spelled correctly, but the loop of the R and the slant of the G in my last name were foreign. I had never signed those forms. One, dated just 6 months ago, appeared to grant Evan the ability to manage certain financial transactions on my behalf. I knew instantly this was not my doing. I set the forged documents aside, my mind running through what I knew about chain of custody and authentication. A forgery could be proven, but the real weapon here was not outrage, it was proof, and proof had to be gathered carefully. If I confronted them too soon, they could destroy evidence, close accounts, or twist the story. If I waited, I could collect enough to make their position untenable. By the time I closed the last binder, I had a clear outline in my head. The foundation of their plan depended on the illusion that they had already taken control. They wanted me to feel powerless, to accept that the decision was theirs to make. But the documents in my hands told a different story. The title was still mine, the emergency fund was secure, and their so-called authorizations were fraudulent. Paper had weight, and in the right setting it could crush the entire scaffolding they had built. I sat at the workbench for a long time, the folders open around me like a map of a battlefield. In service, you learned that winning did not always mean charging forward. Sometimes it meant waiting, letting the enemy believe they were advancing while you quietly set the trap. That was exactly what I intended to do. From here on, every step I took would be deliberate. Every document would be copied, scanned, and stored in more than one location. Every conversation would be noted with time and date. The cracks in their wall were there. My job now was to widen them until the whole thing collapsed under its own weight. And I would do it with the same precision I had once used to lay a bridge across enemy ground, quietly, steadily, and without a single wasted move. I knew that paper alone would not be enough. Documents could be argued over, signatures disputed, intentions reframed, but a voice, caught in the act of planning, left little room for interpretation. In the military, we called it confirmation, not just having the coordinates on a map, but seeing the target through the scope. If I wanted to end this without giving them an escape route, I needed their own words to stand beside the black and white evidence. The kitchen was the heart of their planning. I had learned that much from the patterns of their movement and the fragments of conversation I overheard when I passed through. Marissa liked to pour her wine there after dinner. Leaning against the counter while Evan sat at the table, it was where their guard was lowest, where they spoke freely once they thought I had gone to bed. I needed to hear what they said when they believed the house was empty of anyone who mattered. The solution came in the form of a recessed light fixture over the kitchen island. It had been there for years, and no one paid it any attention. I found a small audio recorder, the kind that activated only when it picked up sound above a certain threshold. The device fit neatly inside the base of the fixture, invisible from below. Once it was in place, I tested it myself. A quiet murmur did not trigger it, but a normal conversation did. The playback was clean, every syllable sharp. For days, I went about my routine as if nothing had changed. I made sure to leave the house at predictable times, to give them opportunities to speak without restraint. I kept my phone off when I was out, just in case they were tempted to test whether I was still inside. Each evening I retrieved the recorder, downloaded the files to an encrypted drive, and returned it before anyone noticed it had been touched. It was on the fourth night that I got what I needed. Their voices came through as clearly as if I were standing beside them. Marissa was speaking first. Her tone casual in that way people sound when discussing a plan they have already decided is inevitable. Once she's in long-term care, she said, we can refinance without the risk. The bank will approve it faster if she's not living here. Evan's reply was quick, almost eager. And we can get the remodel started before spring. Open up the kitchen, knock out the wall to the dining room. It'll sell higher if it looks modern. They were not talking about my comfort. They were talking about my absence, the kind of absence you do not return from. The conversation rolled on to details, how they might explain it to relatives, what they would tell the neighbors. At one point, Evan laughed and said, "She won't fight it, she never does." Listening to those words, I felt the same calm I used to feel before a mission. Not rage, not fear, just the knowledge that I now held something they could not explain away. They might argue about deeds and authorizations, but there was no polite explanation for plotting to remove me under the guise of care so they could cash in on my home. I labeled the file with the date and time, then backed it up in 3 separate locations, one on a secure cloud service, one on an external drive locked in my desk, and one on a small flash drive I kept on my person. This was not just insurance. This was the nail that would hold the entire case together when the moment came to reveal it. From that day forward, I stopped worrying about whether I would win. The facts were mine now, in their voices, in their own words. All I had to do was choose the stage, the audience, and the exact second to press play. The moment I had both the documents and the recordings, I knew the next step was not to confront them, but to secure my position. In the field, you never launched a counterattack without reinforcing your lines first. That meant finding someone who understood both the rules and how to bend them to protect the mission. I needed an ally who would not flinch at the complexity of family betrayal layered with legal maneuvering. That is how I called David Mercer. Years ago, he had been my commanding officer on a project overseas, a man with a sharp mind for logistics and a calm under pressure that I had always respected. When a training injury ended his military career, he went to law school and specialized in estate and property law. We had not spoken in years, but when he picked up the phone, it was as if no time had passed. "I was wondering when you'd call," he said after hearing my voice. I told him everything, start to finish, the gradual takeover, the forged signatures, the recordings. Listened without interrupting, the way he used to during mission briefings, letting the whole picture form before speaking. "All right," he said when I finished. "We do this in 3 phases. First, you put the house into a living trust that you alone control. That makes it legally separate from you as an individual, which means they cannot touch it without your consent. Second, we revoke every power of attorney they think they have and file those revocations with the county. Third, we freeze any account they've been accessing under the pretense of helping you. We do it clean, without giving them grounds to claim we acted in bad faith." Over the next week, my small study became what I called the war room. Every surface was covered in files, forms, and notes. David worked with precision, drafting the trust documents, arranging for a notary to come to my apartment, and filing everything with the proper agencies before Marissa or Evan could realize the shift had occurred. Each evening, I updated a master list of assets and accounts, marking off which had been secured and which were still vulnerable. The trust came first. By transferring ownership of the house into it, I created a legal wall they could not breach without my signature, a wall they would not even see until it was too late. Then came the revocations. David had a clerk hand-deliver them to the institutions involved, ensuring there was a clear record of when the authority ended. If Evan tried to use those forged documents now, he would run straight into a compliance officer holding the revocation in hand. Finally, we moved on the accounts. Every withdrawal labeled for family or house expenses was scrutinized. David arranged for freeze on shared accounts pending verification, which meant they could no longer drain funds without explanation. If they tried, the bank would call me directly. By the time the work was done, the shape of the battlefield had changed entirely. They still believed they were moving freely toward their goal, but in reality, every path they might take was now blocked. All that remained was for me to choose when to reveal that the game had shifted, and with Thanksgiving approaching, the timing could not have been more perfect. David's final piece of advice before we wrapped up that week stayed with me. "Let them make the move they've been planning," he said. "The more public they are, the more damaging it will be when you counter. Remember, you are not retaliating, you are correcting the record." I nodded even though he could not see it over the phone. That was exactly what this was, not vengeance, not spite. Just a precise, lawful correction, one that would leave no doubt about who had truly been in control all along. Once the legal groundwork was in place, I shifted my focus to the other front in this battle: perception. Marissa and Evan had been crafting their image for months, maybe longer. They wanted to be seen as the caring younger generation stepping in to look after an aging parent who, in their words, was slipping. They were counting on sympathy, on the idea that people would applaud them for taking responsibility. That kind of performance needs an audience, and they had already chosen the stage. I learned from my sister, almost by accident, that they were planning to make a statement at Thanksgiving dinner. The invitations had gone out to family, close friends, even a few neighbors who had no real reason to be there. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. They were going to frame me as someone who could not manage my own affairs, all under the soft lighting of a holiday gathering. It was manipulative and calculated, and it gave me the perfect opportunity to turn the whole thing back on them. I made no attempt to interfere with their guest list. In fact, I encouraged it. I asked casual questions about who might be coming, feigning mild curiosity. Evan, perhaps overconfident, even joked about how everyone should hear the news at once. I smiled and let him think I was clueless. Meanwhile, my preparations moved quietly forward. I printed copies of the most critical evidence, bank statements showing unauthorized transfers, time-stamped logs from the recorder transcripts, and legal documents proving the house was beyond their reach. Each set was collated and sealed in its own envelope, one for every household that would be present. They were stacked neatly in a folder, ready to be handed out when the time came. The audio files were my ace. David helped me transfer the clearest segment, the conversation about putting me in long-term care to refinance the house, onto a small, portable player. The player paired with a wireless remote that could start playback instantly. I tested it repeatedly, sitting at my dining table with the remote hidden in my palm, pressing the button until I could do it without looking. I also made a deliberate choice about how I would present myself on the day. This was not going to be a scene where I raised my voice or demanded justice. If anything, I wanted my calm to contrast with their performance. Let them deliver their speech about protecting me in front of a crowd. Let them bask in the nods and murmurs of approval. The higher they climbed in their self-righteous act, the harder the fall would be when the truth arrived. There was a certain satisfaction in knowing they were building my platform for me. The long table, the assembled guests, the polite quiet that falls over a room when someone taps a glass for attention, all of it would serve my purpose better than any private confrontation could. They thought they were setting the terms of my humiliation. What they were really doing was constructing the perfect stage for me to dismantle their story, piece by piece. With the same precision I had once used to dismantle a faulty bridge before it collapsed. As the day approached, I walked through the plan again and again. I would wait until they made their announcement. I would remain seated, envelope in hand, until they finished. Then I would speak not to them but to the room, and when the moment was right, I would press the button. Their own voices would fill the air, and there would be no taking the words back. I had been patient this long. One more week was nothing. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, the stage would be set exactly as they intended, and I would be ready to take it from them without raising mine. The room was warm with the smell of roasted turkey, buttered rolls, and spiced cider when Evan tapped his glass for silence. Conversation faded, forks were set down, and every face turned toward him. Marissa stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, wearing an expression carefully arranged somewhere between concern and resolve. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her tone soft, almost tender. "This is about family, about making sure the people we love are cared for." She glanced at me with a look meant to seem loving but edged with pity. "Some of you may have noticed that Mom has been having trouble keeping up with things lately. Forgetfulness, confusion." There were sympathetic murmurs from the table. She let them settle before continuing. "Evan and I have started the process of assuming guardianship. It's not about control, it's about love. We just want to make sure everything is handled responsibly." I let her finish, sitting completely still, my hands folded in my lap. The envelope lay on the chair beside me, its weight familiar now. When she paused, clearly expecting me to nod or offer some meek acknowledgement, I reached down, picked it up, and set it gently in the center of the table. Before you go any further, I said, my voice steady, I have a gift for you. Marissa blinked, then forced a smile, perhaps thinking it was some awkward attempt at humor. Evan leaned forward to pull the envelope toward them. He slid out the contents and began to read. His smile faltered almost immediately. The first page was the legal eviction notice, signed and dated, removing both of them from any claim to the house. The next was the trust document, transferring the property entirely out of their reach. Beneath that was the itemized account of every unauthorized transaction they had made over the past year, complete with dates and amounts. And then on the final page, a full transcript of their conversation about placing me in long-term care to refinance the home. The room had gone utterly still, save for the sound of paper being shuffled by unsteady hands. Evan's face had drained of color. Marissa looked from the pages to me, her mouth opening as if to protest, but no words came. That's not, she started, but I pressed the small remote in my hand. From a portable speaker near my chair, her voice filled the dining room, clear and sharp. Once she's in long-term care, we can refinance without the risk. The bank will approve it faster if she's not living here. Evan's voice followed, equally distinct, and we can get the remodel started before spring. Open up the kitchen, knock out the wall to the dining room. It'll sell higher if it looks modern. The reaction was immediate. A few guests gasped. My sister's eyes widened. She looked from them to me as if trying to reconcile the image of the caring daughter with the voice plotting my removal. Cousin Tom leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his expression one of quiet disgust. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply let the words hang in the air until they became impossible to deny. You've had your say, I told them evenly. Now the rest of the family can decide what they think of it. Marissa's face flushed deep red. You bugged the house, she snapped. I protected it, I replied. They had come expecting applause for their performance. Instead, they stood exposed, their own words and actions laid bare before the people they had tried to win over. The tide in the room shifted, not because I had demanded it, but because no one could unhear what they had just heard. The power they thought they held slipped away in the silence that followed. And as I looked around the table at the faces of people who now knew the truth, I understood that my victory did not come from the documents or even the recording. It came from refusing to fight on their terms and making them face the truth on mine. When the dinner ended, I did not linger to watch them stumble through the wreckage of their own making. I collected my coat, thanked the guests who met my eyes, and stepped out into the cold night. The air felt cleaner beyond the walls of that house. As if I had walked out of a storm I had been standing in for far too long. Snow crunched under my shoes as I made my way to the car. I did not look back. Within a week I had signed the lease on a small apartment across town. It was nothing grand, 2 rooms and a narrow balcony, but it was mine. No one else had a key. No one else could decide who walked through the door. The first night I slept there, the quiet felt unfamiliar, almost too still. But by morning, it had begun to feel like a boundary I had reclaimed, a border drawn in the simplest of lines. This space is for me. Life took on a different rhythm. I made my own coffee each morning without finding the sugar jar moved or the mugs rearranged. I came home to the same scene I had left, no unexplained lights or faint traces of another person's perfume. I knew exactly who had crossed my threshold each day. And that knowledge was worth more than the square footage I had given up. The first sign of them came about a month later in the form of a voicemail. Evan's voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. He said there had been an accident, black ice on the freeway, a spin out into the guardrail. He was all right, but the message hung on an odd pause before he added, I think we should talk. There was no apology, no admission, just a vague suggestion of something unspoken. I called back 2 days later, not out of urgency but curiosity. He answered on the second ring. His tone was hesitant, almost searching, as if he was trying to find the right shape for his words. He mentioned the hospital stay, how it had given him time to think, how maybe we had all been too stubborn. He did not say sorry, I noticed that. Instead, he circled around it, talking about family, about mistakes on both sides. I listened. I gave him the room to speak, but I did not offer comfort or agreement. When he finally stopped, I told him simply that I was glad he was recovering, and then I ended the call. I could hear the surprise in his voice as I said goodbye. He had expected more, a rush to reconcile, a warm reopening of the door. But that door was not mine to reopen. It had been closed for a reason. Forgiveness, I had come to understand, was not an invitation to return to the way things had been. It was not a reset button, erasing the harm as if it had never happened. Forgiveness was a boundary. It was the quiet acknowledgement that I would no longer carry the weight of their actions, but also the clear decision that they would not carry the privilege of my trust again. I could let go of the anger without letting go of the lesson, and so when the line went dead, I felt no guilt for not offering more. I had survived the dismantling of my home, the slow theft of my independence, and the betrayal of my own child. I did not owe anyone the illusion that everything could be made whole again. The apartment was silent when I set the phone down. Outside, the city moved as it always did, unaware of the shift that had taken place inside me. I poured myself a cup of coffee, stood by the window, and understood that sometimes the most important part of healing is knowing when not to answer the knock, even if it comes wrapped in the language of apology. The decision to sell the house did not come quickly, but when it did, it felt clean. I had already taken it back in every way that mattered, legally, financially, morally. Keeping it now would have been like holding on to a battlefield after the fight was over, with the smell of smoke still in the soil. I wanted something new, something untouched by their intentions. The buyers were a young couple, both teachers, who spoke about the place with the kind of reverence I had once felt when my husband and I first walked through its door. They loved the original woodwork, the slightly uneven floorboards, the sturdy banister worn smooth by years of hands. They said they could see themselves raising a family here, filling the rooms with noise and life. When the papers were signed, I handed them the keys without ceremony. I did not tell them the history they were inheriting. That story belonged to me now, and I was not passing it along. Weeks later, they invited me to stop by. I almost said no, but curiosity got the better of me. The house was brighter than I remembered. They had refinished the dining table I once fought to keep, sanding away years of scratches and dents, but keeping the grain visible. On it sat bowls of fruit and scattered homework papers. Laughter came from the next room, the easy, unguarded kind that only exists when people feel safe. The air smelled of cinnamon and fresh coffee, not the tense stillness that had hung there in the end. Standing in the doorway, I felt something I had not expected, relief. The house had a new chapter now, one that did not need me to oversee it. It no longer carried the weight of betrayal. It was simply a home again. It was around that time my granddaughter Lily reached out. Her voice on the phone was hesitant, almost shy. She asked if we could meet for coffee. When she arrived, she was holding a small envelope. Inside was a card I had written her years ago when she was still in grade school. The paper was worn, the ink slightly faded, but my handwriting was clear. When people fail you, remember you are still whole. You were never their missing piece to begin with. She told me she had found it tucked in a box her mother had meant to throw away. She had kept it because it reminded her of who I was before the stories about me had changed. We sat for hours, talking about her classes, her plans, and the memories she still carried of the house when it was filled with joy. I realized then that I did not need to reclaim the stage they had tried to take from me. I did not need to rewrite the narrative in anyone's mind but my own. The life I wanted was not one of proving or defending. It was one of building again, not with walls and foundations, but with trust, presence, and the quiet spaces where truth could grow. The old house had found its voice again in the laughter of people who valued it. My own voice had returned in the conversations with someone who had chosen to know me for herself. I had no desire to step back into the play they once cast me in. I was writing a different script now, one with fewer scenes, more silence, and an honesty that did not need an audience. And in that new story, there was no villain to fight, no role to defend. Only a life to be lived, steady and unperformed, under a roof that was finally my own, even if it stood somewhere else. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind where the light comes in slow through the curtains and the streets outside seem to move at half their usual pace. I sat at my desk with my journal open, pen in hand, and wrote a single line. I did not win by striking back, I won by making the truth undeniable. The words looked simple on the page, but they carried the weight of everything that had led me here. Beside me, a mug of black coffee steamed gently. I took a slow sip and listened to the faint hum of the city through the window, the sound of traffic blocks away, the occasional bark of a dog, the muffled rhythm of someone's footsteps on the sidewalk. The noise felt distant, almost like the background track to a life that was finally mine again. For years, I had believed that family was a constant, that its noise, the arguments, the laughter, the interruptions, was proof of its presence. But now I understood that noise and connection are not the same. Sometimes what people call family is just the loud repetition of old roles that no longer fit. True family, I realized, can be quiet. It can be the stillness of trust, the calm of knowing you no longer need to defend yourself to be believed. Sometimes it is knowing exactly when to place an envelope on the table and exactly when to lay down your pen so that peace can speak for you. I closed the journal, set my coffee aside, and let the quiet fill the room. It did not feel empty. It felt whole.